It didn't start with a fight. It didn't even start with a rumor. It started with a feeling, one of those quiet, unsettling shifts you can't explain, but you know something isn't right. Claressa Shields had built her entire life on instinct, on reading her opponent before the punch ever came. But this time, the hit didn't come in the ring. It came in real life, and she never saw it coming. Because everything, at first, felt real. The love, the support, the promises, it all sounded solid. And when Papoose spoke, it didn't feel like confusion. It felt like certainty. Like a man who knew exactly what he wanted. But then, something shifted. Slowly. Quietly. And by the time the truth surfaced, it didn't come through a conversation. It came through moments, public ones, that couldn't be explained away. Moments that led right back to Remy, a history that, allegedly, was never really over. Now, Claressa isn't just emotional, she's realizing something deeper. What if she was never the choice, just the moment? From the outside, everything looked like it was moving in a direction that made sense. Claressa Shields wasn't new to pressure, attention, or public scrutiny. She had spent her entire life proving people wrong, breaking records, and stepping into spaces where she wasn't expected to dominate, and then dominating anyway. So when she began appearing more publicly connected to Papoose, people didn't question her strength. If anything, they assumed she had chosen carefully. At first, it didn't look like chaos. It looked like alignment. Conversations that seemed intentional. Support that felt present. A sense that someone understood her pace, her discipline, her world. And for someone like Claressa, who moves through life with structure and intensity, that kind of emotional calm can feel rare enough to trust immediately. But what people don't always see in these situations is how quickly calm can start to feel like certainty, and how certainty can quietly become dependency, without either person noticing the transition happening in real time. In the beginning, there was admiration. Papoose wasn't just seen as a partner figure, he was seen as someone who understood longevity. Someone who had survived his own storms, his own public narratives, and still maintained a reputation for loyalty and resilience. That history carried weight. It created trust before anything else even had to be proven. And then there was the story that always lingered in the background, Remy. Not as a rumor at first. Not as a scandal. But as context. The kind of context that shapes how people interpret everything that comes after it. A long relationship. A public bond. A history that had been through separation conversations, reconciliation energy, and years of being publicly defined as complicated, but unbroken in spirit. That kind of history doesn't disappear just because new attention enters the frame. But in the early stages, it wasn't positioned as a threat. It was positioned as something resolved. Something in the past. Something managed. And that framing matters, because it determines how someone like Claressa walks into the situation. She didn't walk in like someone trying to replace history. She walked in like someone stepping into a present-tense connection. According to the tone she expressed in interviews and conversations, what she experienced felt supportive. Different from what she had known before. More intentional. More verbally affirming. More structured in its emotional availability. That kind of attention can be disarming, especially for someone who is used to emotional discipline. In the ring, Claressa controls everything: distance, timing, reaction. But outside of it, when someone else controls emotional pacing, it can feel like relief rather than risk. And that's where things begin to blur. Because what starts as support can slowly become guidance. What feels like guidance can slowly become influence. And what feels like influence can slowly become control, not always in an obvious way. but in the way decisions start aligning around one person's direction without being openly questioned. By the time people started paying closer attention, Claressa had already begun speaking about Papoose in deeply personal terms. She described support that felt different, communication that felt stabilizing, energy that felt protective. Those aren't casual descriptions. They are emotional anchors. They indicate trust has already moved past observation and into investment. An investment is where vulnerability begins. Behind the scenes, according to circulating narratives and online discussion, there were already complexities that weren't part of the public framing. The ongoing presence of Remy in the larger narrative wasn't something that had fully disappeared. It had simply become less visible in public conversation. But less visible doesn't mean resolved. It just means quieter. And quiet things have a way of becoming louder when pressure is applied. As Claressa continued building what she believed was a forward-moving relationship, subtle changes allegedly began to surface. Not dramatic confrontations. Not public disputes. Just shifts. Timing differences. Slight inconsistencies in availability. Conversations that required more clarification than before. At first, those shifts are easy to rationalize. Busy schedules. Professional responsibilities. Personal pressure. Especially in environments where public image and private life overlap, inconsistency can be explained away as normal complexity. But emotional intuition doesn't rely on explanations. It relies on pattern recognition. And patterns, once noticed, don't disappear easily. The turning point wasn't a single argument. It wasn't a single revelation. It was accumulation. Small moments stacking on top of each other until they no longer felt random. Delayed responses that became recurring. Reassurances that began to sound familiar instead of reassuring. Conversations that once expanded into planning began circling back into vagueness. And in parallel, the outside world started speaking louder. Fans, observers, and online commentary began connecting dots that weren't part of the private experience, but still influenced perception. That's one of the most dangerous parts of modern celebrity dynamics. Even when you try to live privately, interpretation follows you publicly. Claressa, from everything being discussed, didn't immediately react with confrontation. Instead, she processed. Asked questions. Looked for clarity. Tried to understand whether what she was feeling internally matched what she was being told externally. And the responses she received, reportedly, were still confident. Still composed. Still structured in a way that made doubt feel unnecessary. But doubt doesn't always need permission to grow. It grows in silence. In pauses. In moments where emotional reassurance stops feeling new and starts feeling recycled. And that's where the emotional foundation begins to weaken. Not through lies that are obvious, but through truth that feels incomplete. Because partial truth is more destabilizing than outright dishonesty. Outright dishonesty is easy to reject. Partial truth forces you to question your own judgment. At this stage, Claressa wasn't reacting publicly. She was adjusting internally. Recalibrating what she thought she understood about the situation. Trying to reconcile the version of events she was living with the version that seemed to be forming around her. And then came the moment that changed the emotional direction entirely, not through a private confession, but through visibility. What emerged wasn't just information. It was confirmation through presence. A return to familiarity that could not be ignored or reframed as misunderstanding. The presence of Papoose and Remy together again, in a way that reactivated everything people assumed had already been settled. And in that moment, the emotional timeline collapsed. Because suddenly, every past conversation took on new meaning. Every reassurance was reinterpreted. Every moment of doubt felt validated in hindsight. But the hardest part wasn't even anger. It was realization. The realization that she may not have been operating in a space of full clarity from the beginning. That what felt like building something forward might have been unfolding alongside something unfinished. And that realization doesn't explode outward, it turns inward. It forces reflection. It forces re-evaluation of every emotional decision made along the way. What makes this situation resonate so strongly isn't just the names involved. It's the structure of it. The way trust forms slowly, then suddenly feels questioned all at once. The way history doesn't disappear just because new chapters begin. And the way emotional certainty can feel real right up until the moment it doesn't. For Claressa, the early stage of this story wasn't about confrontation. It was about belief. Belief that what she was stepping into was stable. Belief that communication meant clarity. Belief that presence meant priority. But belief, when it collides with unresolved history, doesn't always survive unchanged. And as that foundation begins to shift, everything built on top of it starts to feel uncertain, not because it was never real, but because it may not have been complete. The moment everything shifted wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with confrontation or a public breakdown. It arrived quietly, in fragments, things that didn't fully make sense until they were seen together. And once they were seen together, there was no way to unsee them. For Claressa Shields, that was the beginning of a different kind of fight. Not in the ring, not against an opponent she could study and prepare for, but against uncertainty itself. The kind that builds in your mind when answers stop feeling complete. At this point, what people around her reportedly began noticing wasn't immediate anger. It was distance. Not physical distance, but emotional recalibration. The same person who once spoke with confidence about what she believed was unfolding started becoming more measured. More observant. Less reactive. Because something fundamental had changed. Trust was no longer automatic. And once trust becomes something you have to actively maintain, instead of something you feel naturally, every interaction starts to carry weight. Meanwhile, the external narrative continued to evolve around Papoose and Remy, whose long and complicated history had always been part of public conversation. Even when things appeared calm on the surface, the history itself never stopped existing. It simply became less visible in day-to-day appearances, which created space for assumptions, interpretations, and competing narratives. And that's where the pressure intensified, because Claressa wasn't just dealing with what she knew. She was also dealing with what she was seeing, hearing, and being forced to interpret in real time. At first, she reportedly tried to make sense of it through conversation. Asking questions. Looking for consistency. Trying to separate noise from truth. And the responses she received, according to circulating accounts, were still calm, still confident, still framed in reassurance. But reassurance only works when it evolves with clarity. When it starts repeating instead of expanding, it stops grounding you. That's when emotional confusion begins to take hold. Because you start noticing something strange. The words don't change, but your interpretation of them does. A conversation that once felt reassuring begins to feel incomplete. A statement that once felt certain begins to feel carefully structured. A promise that once felt future-oriented begins to feel conditional. And when that shift happens repeatedly, it stops feeling like coincidence. It starts feeling like pattern recognition. At this stage of the situation, the tension wasn't public chaos, it was internal instability. And that's often the part people miss when they watch celebrity narratives unfold from the outside. The loudest moments are rarely the most important ones. The most important moments are the quiet ones where someone realizes they are no longer fully confident in what they were once certain about. For Claressa, that realization didn't happen all at once. It accumulated. A delayed response here. A change in tone there. A conversation that ended more abruptly than expected. A plan that stayed vague instead of becoming concrete. Small things that, individually, could be dismissed. But together, they formed something harder to ignore. And in parallel, the public environment kept feeding the situation with interpretations, speculation, and fragmented updates that added emotional pressure without providing clarity. That combination, internal doubt and external noise, is where emotional overload begins. Because now you're not just trying to understand what's happening. You're also trying to filter what everyone else thinks is happening. And those two things rarely align cleanly. According to circulating commentary and fan analysis, this is where Claressa began pulling inward. Not necessarily withdrawing from the relationship publicly, but becoming more internally cautious. Less willing to accept surface-level reassurance without deeper clarity behind it. And that shift changes the dynamic entirely. Because once one person in a relationship starts requiring proof instead of trust, everything becomes heavier. Every interaction starts to feel like it needs validation. Every answer needs reinforcement. Every moment becomes something to analyze instead of something to experience. And that's emotionally exhausting for both sides. But what made this situation more complex was the unresolved historical presence of Remy in the larger narrative. Even when not directly involved in day-to-day interactions, her name and history remained part of the emotional background of everything unfolding. Not because of constant conflict, but because of unresolved continuity. And unresolved continuity is powerful. It means the story doesn't feel like it has a clean beginning or end. It feels like it has layers that keep reactivating under pressure. As Claressa continued processing what she was seeing and feeling, the emotional tone reportedly shifted from curiosity to caution. Not because she had confirmation of anything specific at that point, but because consistency itself was no longer guaranteed. And that's a key turning point in any emotional narrative, when you stop measuring truth by what is said, and start measuring it by what remains stable over time. Because stability becomes the new evidence. And when stability begins to weaken, even slightly, it forces re-evaluation. This is where the psychological weight of the situation begins to deepen. Not because of a single revelation, but because of the absence of resolution. Conversations don't fully close. Questions don't fully get answered. Emotional reassurance doesn't fully evolve into clarity. Instead, everything stays just open enough to keep interpretation alive. And interpretation is where anxiety grows. At the same time, Claressa's public persona remained strong. That contrast is important. Because externally, nothing looked broken in a dramatic sense. But internally, she was reportedly navigating a growing gap between what she was being told and what she was starting to perceive. And that gap is where emotional instability forms. Because the mind cannot settle when two realities exist at once. One reality is what you're being told. The other is what you're starting to feel. And when those two don't match, you start trying to decide which one to trust. That decision is rarely immediate. It takes time. It takes repetition. It takes moments stacking on top of each other until one version becomes more believable than the other. For Claressa, that tipping point wasn't just about conversation anymore. It was about visibility. When public moments began reinforcing the unresolved history between Papoose and Remy, it didn't introduce new information as much as it reinforced existing uncertainty. And reinforcement is powerful. Because it doesn't need to be explained. It simply confirms what was already being questioned internally. That's when emotional structure begins to collapse, not outwardly, but inwardly. And once that internal structure starts to collapse, clarity becomes unavoidable. Not immediate, but inevitable. At that stage, the situation stops being about speculation and starts becoming about interpretation of what has already been seen. And for Claressa, that meant confronting a reality where certainty was no longer stable, and where reassurance no longer carried the same emotional weight it once did. And when that shift happens, the next phase of the story is no longer about confusion. It becomes about realization. The moment the story spilled fully into the public space, it stopped belonging to just Claressa, Papoose, or Remy. It became something larger, something the internet could stretch, reshape, and replay from every possible angle. And once that happens, emotions that were once private begin to feel like global commentary. For Claressa Shields, that shift reportedly felt disorienting. Not because she wasn't used to attention, but because this type of attention was different. Inside the ring, pressure is structured. It has rules, rounds, and an ending. Outside of it, pressure spreads without limits. It repeats itself in comments, in reposts, in speculation that never fully dies down. What made this phase so intense was how quickly perception began to split. Some people viewed her as someone who trusted deeply in a situation that was already complicated before she entered it. Others saw her as someone who was fully aware of the history and still chose to step into it anyway. But neither interpretation changed the emotional reality she was allegedly dealing with behind closed doors. And behind those doors, the atmosphere reportedly became quieter, not calmer. There is a specific kind of silence that follows emotional overload. It is not peace. It is exhaustion. It is what happens when explaining yourself no longer feels productive, because every explanation gets absorbed into a louder narrative already running outside of you. Claressa, according to circulating reports, began withdrawing from the noise in subtle ways first. Less engagement online. Fewer reactions to commentary. A noticeable shift from addressing things directly to letting things exist without response. That kind of silence is often misunderstood publicly, but internally it is usually a form of protection. Because once a situation becomes public property, every word you add to it risks being reshaped. At the same time, the broader conversation around Papoose and Remy Ma's long history continued to resurface. Not as new information, but as context people refused to separate from the present. Their names carried years of emotional memory for fans, and that history made it difficult for many to view anything involving them as a clean slate. So when Claressa entered the picture, even briefly in the public imagination, she became part of a timeline that was already emotionally loaded. And timelines like that rarely stay simple. What intensified everything further was the way social media cycles work. Every clip gets slowed down. Every sentence gets analyzed. Every facial expression becomes evidence for a theory someone wants to prove. In that environment, emotional nuance disappears quickly, replaced by interpretation. An interpretation is powerful, but not always accurate. Claressa's professional identity continued moving forward during this time, but the contrast between her public discipline and private emotional weight became more visible to audiences. That contrast created a narrative tension that the internet latched onto. Because people are used to seeing champions in control, not in conflict. But control is not a constant state. It is a practiced one. And even the most disciplined individuals experience moments where emotional processing takes priority over presentation. What allegedly made this period more difficult was the sense of being discussed rather than understood. Once a narrative reaches that stage, it becomes less about truth and more about momentum. People repeat what they've heard, not necessarily what they know. And momentum is hard to stop. Inside that momentum, Claressa's reactions were interpreted in multiple ways. Some saw vulnerability. Others saw frustration. Others projected their own assumptions onto her responses. But what often gets lost in that cycle is that real people are experiencing something real while being turned into a topic of debate. That disconnect is where emotional strain deepens. As the situation continued to circulate, attention also shifted toward the idea of loyalty. Not just romantic loyalty, but perceived loyalty within overlapping histories. Papoose and Remy Ma's long connection remained a central reference point in almost every discussion, whether directly mentioned or indirectly implied. That made it difficult for any new development to exist without being measured against the past. And when the past is that prominent, the present is never neutral. Claressa reportedly found herself in a position where every angle was being interpreted through a lens she did not control. Even silence was interpreted. Even distance was analyzed. In modern celebrity culture, absence is rarely seen as neutral. It is often read as meaning something unspoken. But sometimes absence is just space. Space to think. Space to stabilize. Space to separate internal emotion from external pressure. What complicates that space is the expectation of immediate clarity. Public narratives often demand resolution quickly, even when the people involved are still processing what happened. That mismatch creates tension between lived experience and audience expectation. And Claressa, being a high-profile athlete, exists in both worlds simultaneously. According to the narrative being discussed online, one of the most difficult aspects of this phase was not just the relationship speculation itself, but the way it intersected with her identity as a champion. Because champions are often expected to be emotionally unshakable in all areas of life, not just competition. That expectation is unrealistic, but persistent. And when reality does not match expectation, audiences often feel entitled to fill in the gaps with their own interpretations. Meanwhile, the presence of Remy Ma in the broader conversation remained constant, not because of direct engagement, but because of historical association. In stories like this, history functions almost like gravity. It pulls every new development into its orbit whether it belongs there or not. That is part of what made this situation feel so heavy for many observers. It wasn't just one relationship being discussed. It was multiple layers of history, identity, and public perception colliding at once. And collisions like that do not resolve quickly. They echo. As time moved forward, Claressa's approach, according to reports, leaned more toward containment than confrontation. Not feeding into every discussion. Not responding to every interpretation. Allowing the noise to exist, without giving it constant engagement. That shift is often misunderstood as withdrawal, but in reality, it can be recalibration. Because when external voices become too loud, internal clarity requires distance. The emotional tone surrounding the situation also began to change slightly as more people started reflecting on the human cost of public relationships. Beyond the entertainment value, there was a growing awareness that these are real people dealing with real emotional consequences while millions watch and comment. And that awareness shifted the conversation in subtle ways. Less certainty. More questioning. Less assumption. More reflection. Still, uncertainty remained the dominant feeling. Because no matter how many opinions were shared, the core reality stayed unresolved in the public eye. And unresolved stories tend to linger longer than concluded ones. 4. Claressa, the narrative reportedly became less about responding and more about rebuilding internal balance. Returning focus to training, structure, and the environment where outcomes are clear and effort translates directly into results. That environment does not eliminate emotional complexity, but it does provide order. And order becomes essential when everything outside of it feels unpredictable. The contrast between her two worlds became even more noticeable during this period. In one, she is evaluated round by round, moment by moment, with clear metrics. In the other, she is evaluated through interpretation, speculation, and incomplete information. Living between those two systems creates strain even for the strongest individuals. And that strain is what defined this chapter more than any single moment or headline. Because long after the clips stop circulating and the comments move on to something new, what remains is the internal process of making sense of what actually happened versus what was believed to have happened. And that difference is where clarity slowly begins to form. Not through public resolution, but through private understanding that develops over time, away from the noise, away from the interpretations, and away from the versions of the story that were never fully accurate to begin with. Now that everything has unfolded and the noise around Claressa Shields, Papoose, and Remy continues to echo across social media, the real question isn't just what happened, it's what people take from it. Because at the center of all this drama, all the speculation, and all the emotional reactions, is a human experience that millions of people quietly relate to in their own lives. Trust, timing, loyalty, and the feeling of realizing something wasn't what it seemed after you've already invested your heart into it. Claressa is one of the most dominant fighters of her generation, but this situation reminds everyone watching that even the strongest people in the world can face moments where emotions don't follow logic, and where clarity only arrives after confusion has already taken its toll. And that's what makes this story so powerful. It's not just celebrity gossip. It's a reflection of how complicated relationships can become when history, public pressure, and private emotions all collide at the same time. So now I want to ask you directly, because this is where your perspective matters. Do you think Claressa was truly blindsided by everything that allegedly unfolded? Or do you believe there were signs from the beginning that she just didn't fully accept at the time? And when someone enters a situation tied to a long history like Papoose and Remy, is emotional distance even realistically possible? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because every opinion adds another layer to this conversation, and helps understand how people interpret loyalty, love, and betrayal in situations like this. If you found this breakdown insightful, and you want more deep dives into celebrity stories that go beyond headlines, and into the real emotional context behind them, make sure you like this video, and subscribe to the channel right now. We'll be following every update closely, because in stories like this, nothing ever stays still for long, and the next development could shift the entire narrative all over again.